Hello, and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned. Over the last few episodes, we've been exploring something that most of us rarely think about. The systems that keep ticking over underneath everything that enables us to keep living our lives. From infrastructure and buildings to energy networks and industrial operations, many of the systems we depend on were designed for a different era. One with more predictable demand, more stable environmental conditions, and less operational complexity. But that is changing. As energy systems shift, climate pressures increase, and industries become more interconnected, infrastructure increasingly has to be actively managed. It needs to be optimized and coordinated in real time. And that's changing the role that technology plays inside the real economy. Many of the technology discussions we have today are focused on AI, and by that I mean chatbots and content generation or even office productivity. But a very different conversation is happening inside industrial systems, energy networks, manufacturing, logistics, and critical infrastructure. In those environments, technology is increasingly being used not just to generate information, but to optimize operations, improve efficiency, reduce emissions, manage capacity, and help complex systems adapt under pressure. So today we're going to be exploring what that actually looks like in practice. We're being joined today by Sophie Graham, Chief Sustainability Officer at IFS, which is a company that works with asset-intensive industries responsible for a very large share of global emissions. With a background in environmental law and a focus on the role of technology in climate action, Sophie's had a front-row view into how operational AI and the different ways in which we can use technology is beginning to reshape industrial systems. So, Sophie, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to work with IFS?
Thank you, Felicia, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. My background has always been sustainability. So I studied environmental law and then I pursued sustainability roles within the finance and the technology sector. And the reason for those two sectors is because I believe they enable change across all other industries. If you look at what it takes to achieve sustainability goals, it is a combination of finance and technology. So I'm working now in IFS and we're specifically focused on asset-intensive industries. We're a leader in industrial AI. So how do we apply the technology and the AI to help optimize systems and also transform operations in the longer term? And where my particular focus is now is around the intersection between that industrial AI and sustainability, particularly decarbonization. So you mentioned that the industries that we work with together are responsible for around 3/4 of global emissions. They have a huge challenge to solve and they're looking for how AI can help them do that.
Well, that's music to my ears because you have to find the levers for change. That's finance, because whoever has the money makes the decisions. And technology is how we change the world around us. We've been doing that since the dawn of time. But to get back to the matter at hand, what we've been exploring in this last arc is how infrastructure systems are actually being operated in this world that's increasingly complicated and interconnected. From your perspective and from the work that you're doing, what exactly is changing inside industrial systems that makes operational intelligence, real-time optimization, all the things we say industrial AI can do, so important today?
The reality is that industrial systems are operating far closer to their limits than they ever have before. There is less margin for error, and there's a great need for agility and adaptability. So we've seen the biggest energy crisis in history happening now, both on the supply side, but also a demand side shock from data center buildouts for AI. We're seeing aging assets and infrastructure and a lack of investment. We're seeing tighter supply chains and raw material scarcity, climate volatility. $1 billion weather event occurs now every 4 weeks. So rare events are now operational reality and day-to-day normality. And that means that what was previously good enough for industries in terms of their planning and their operations is no longer sufficient. And they need much closer to real-time industrial intelligence to help make decisions faster while things are moving on the ground. So moving away from periodic and backwards looking reporting to what is happening right now in the ground. How can I forecast look around the corner to what's going to happen and prepare my operations for that. So that when disruption hits, then the organizations that are able to succeed are those that have a greater handle on their data, their industrial intelligence, and can use that to pivot their operations quickly and avoid disruption.
One of the things that I think has become more and more apparent is that over the last 15, 20 years, we've been talking a lot about the separation between mitigation and adaptation. But what we're beginning to see at the moment, what really matters on the ground is resilience and your capacity to adapt to and survive and even thrive through shocks. And we're calling them shocks, but as you say, these are things that are becoming operational realities on a daily basis. And it seems like the only thing we can be certain of is that everything's going to change in ways that we don't expect. But I'd like to bring it back to something concrete, because obviously a lot of people are looking at how they can deal with emissions. We're going to cut emissions, we're going to mitigate, but that can often feel really abstract. What I'm interested in, especially when you talk about the demand side, the supply side, with asset-heavy industries, where do emissions actually sit in the system? What can companies do?
With asset-intensive industries, we see emissions sitting in two places. So the first one would be in the supply chain. We see Scope 3 is the lion's share of emissions, and usually over 90% of the emissions for the clients that we work with. So supply chain is definitely the first one that I'd call out. And there where we see the challenge is around visibility and adaptability to changes. Do you have visibility down your supply chain, not just your tier 1 suppliers, but tier 2 and tier 3? That becomes really relevant for the manufacturers, for example, that we work with that depend on raw materials and the consistent supply of certain raw materials for their products. The second area where emissions are sitting in industrial operations is the day-to-day operations of machines, of assets. So that really goes to the heart of how efficiently is your equipment being used? How old is your infrastructure? How often does it fail? Which parts are failing and how do you maintain those? Do you look at servitization? A big trend that we've seen is moving away from take, make, waste manufacturing towards I produce a product that I will maintain and own and lend it out as a service, from things like light bulbs to ship coatings, right? So we see those trends around how do you maintain the services and assets that you actually produce. And just to give you a recent example of that with some research that we just put out, we've looked at how the assets that exist in the world today run and noted that around 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions can be considered waste emissions from poorly maintained or outdated infrastructure. And so that represents about 1 to 3 trillion annual drag on the economy as well. So it's not just a climate issue, it really is an issue for the global economy. And if you want to reduce emissions, we have to start looking at not just what new shiny things can we build, but how do we do much better with what we already have? And again, that comes back to how do you maintain those assets? How do you look after what we've already produced and made so that we get the most out of it? And of course, that leads us back into circularity, into the supply chain issue as well.
So that is remarkable, because obviously I'm very aware of the improvements that can be made through predictive maintenance, looking at railways and things like that. But I've honestly never thought about a light bulb as a service before. I love that idea. And that you're connecting waste emissions, and I had no idea they were that high, to the economics, what we're actually wasting as a society. One of the areas that you've actually talked about is the benefits that come from managing grid capacity and integrating renewables. Can you walk me through any sort of example of how AI or software or technology has actually changed what the grid can handle? In the sense, an example of what the constraint was and how it actually was able to be changed in practice?
Yeah. And in many ways, this question has never been more important than it is now. The topic of diversification of energy and availability of energy is incredibly high on the agenda. There is a fundamental mismatch between the pace of renewable deployment and what the grid can actually handle. Someone said that the grid is one of the best inventions of the 20th century, and that's exactly where it has stayed. So last year, just to give another quick piece of context, at New York Climate Week, I heard that there's twice as much renewable energy waiting to be connected to the grid as there is capacity on the grid. And so one of the big problems is that the grid is currently designed for peak loads. It actually there's a lot of latency on the grid. It currently operates at, I think, only around 30-40% of its capacity because it's designed for those peak load moments. So that's really where AI can come in and is already coming in to help manage that much better, to forecast demand, to use latency already in the grid and avoid bottlenecks. So from our side at IFS, we have a customer using dynamic line rating, which uses AI-driven congestion forecasting to unlock 25 to 30% more capacity on existing lines. So in a world where grid connection queues can be 5 years or more, that's a huge win-win. And it's a win-win because it's commercially something incredibly important, that availability of energy and the ability to integrate onto the grid. There's a huge pressure for that greater grid availability with what we already have, but also for sustainability, right? We've got over 90% of the new energy added to the grid in the US last year is from renewable sources. We need to be able to integrate that onto the grid and get that as a usable source of energy for people. So one of the big constraints in the net zero transition is the availability of the grid infrastructure. And there's a lot that AI can do to help with that, right? To help unlock greater capacity on grids and transform to smarter grid management. Separately to that, we're also seeing outside of the traditional infrastructure and transmission lines, a lot of rise of plug and play solar and alternative sources of energy. And we've seen that, I think I just came back from Asia. I think Pakistan is a particularly interesting example at the moment. Traditionally, oil and gas, 98% of it came from Qatar through the Strait of Hormuz. Just over the last year, an influx of cheap solar panels from China majority have led to solar being the most popular source of electricity right now in Pakistan. That has been a cost-led and consumer-led rapid change in what is the primary energy source in that country. And that means that it's actually protected and buffered them from the energy crisis on the supply side that's happening right now. So I think that's a particularly interesting one as well to watch, that there is a rise. The energy system as we know it is changing, and it's much more consumer-led. It's more, if you can have plug and play solar, why would you build out new transmission lines, wait for connections to grids? And we can see that with, data centers. They're taking an and approach. They'll have rooftop solar, they'll have local energy production, but they'll also have grid connection, and they'll have many different forms of energy that they'll be relying on to draw energy for their
there's some fascinating shifts happening in different parts of the world with energy and renewables. As you say, I think it really does highlight in the approach we're taking to solve so many of the challenges we face, we're adding complexity and challenge to the systems that we are relying on. And we have to find new ways of solving those problems. And the thing is, we have to find new ways of solving those problems at speed. And speed is not necessarily what human beings are the best at. So that's going to be a really, really interesting tension to see how that plays out. But you mentioned data centers before and how distributed energy can actually be a fantastic way to manage that kind of demand. But there is a tension here. We're talking about AI and technology as a means of optimizing industrial systems, reducing inefficiencies, and using AI to manage these additional complexities. But at the same time, it is driving energy demand, water demand. There was a story recently about a US data center that accidentally took 30 million gallons out of the local water system. And because the sensors weren't working, nobody noticed until the water pressure in the region went down. There's a lot of increasing infrastructure build out because of this kind of demand, and that means increasing resource use. So how do we manage that balancing act?
And data centers are increasingly being treated as critical national infrastructure. So in the race for AI, how do we make sure that the energy that is being needed and taken for data centers does not cause negative effects for communities? We work with Microsoft a lot, and they've done some recent announcements around community first infrastructure and build out. And I think a lot of this goes to how do you plan data centers so that they are not in water scarce regions, so that they do give back to the local economy, so that they can front their own costs and infrastructure for the energy that they will require? I think Ireland is a particularly interesting example to watch right now, because Ireland, about 22% of the energy goes to data centers in Ireland. It's really quite staggering already. They have tied the new build out of data centers to renewable energy and said that the majority, I think it's 80% of the energy that new data centers require, must come from new renewable energy projects. So that means that the likes of Microsoft and the other big hyperscalers are then reaching into those deep pockets to fund renewable energy and new renewable energy projects, which means creation of jobs, etc., that will then go to power their data centers. So that's a way of tying it back to how does this protect the community and actually start to give back jobs. I also have been following some interesting examples around excess heat from data centers and how that can be used to heat greenhouses, which are traditionally gas turbines, and therefore grow tomatoes. So there are some very interesting examples coming out. I think a lot of the problem is around retrofitting the older data centers and those that haven't had that planning from the outset in terms of community impact, water scarcity, energy availability, etc. So that's where I see a lot of the problem with data centers. But if you look at the new generation of data centers that's being built, then I see a lot of promise. A lot of them are near to zero water use. They're at liquid cooling chips, and they're really investing in renewable and scaling renewables because it is a matter of how quickly can they get that data center up and running. And, local renewable energy might be the cheapest and quickest way to get that data center online. There is a clear economic driver for investment in renewable energy and funding behind that. Maybe what I'd also just say is that this is two sides of the same coin. So AI's energy input and carbon input in particular versus the decarbonization impact that it can have on industries. We're starting to see some peer-reviewed studies coming out. There was one last year from LSE and Systemic showing that there is a potential big net decarbonization impact from AI, particularly in the sectors of food, power, and transport. IEA also estimate that it can reduce emissions in the energy sector by 5% by, I think it was 2030. So there is this potential for it to have a net benefit on decarbonization, but these are quite nascent studies, and there's a lot of caveats and are the policy incentives going to be there? Are the market conditions going to support it? So I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of what is that net system impact of AI. But the other thing I take hope from is that we can see increasing standards and transparency coming out from the hyperscalers and from the data center builders around things like green building standards, the benchmarking between them. So we're starting to get more transparency and more standards in place around what good looks like for data center build out with regards to water and energy.
That brings me to a perennial question about institutional and corporate change. We know we need to reduce emissions. We've got the technology that will help us do that, manage the waste, cut the maintenance, all this kind of stuff, new trends in how things are being manufactured, used and maintained. Why is it still so difficult to change the systems that exist? What's the problem in practice?
It's a great question. When we talk about sustainability, often it can come from a place that seems a bit ivory tower, the vision and the business model transformation and the science-aligned climate targets. It can feel out of reach. And I think that's true for many organizations, and particularly those that don't have chief sustainability officers, large sustainability teams. So making it really real, tangible, and simple for companies is key with step by step. So yes, we can look with manufacturing operations at remanufacturing, which is a business model transformation. But hey, we can also look at how do you incorporate emissions into your supplier decisions? And that's just a quite simple addition of if you're going to buy steel from this supplier versus this supplier, this is the carbon differential. And that's without changing their entire business model. So I think it's looking at what can we do today that will help us while not losing sight of the bigger picture transformation that typically takes many years and much deeper strategic conversations about where the entire business is going, what new markets that could help to access, and capital allocation decisions. That said, one of the areas that I'm most excited about with industrial AI is helping with those difficult conversations, right, about the transformation, because words on a page, we've seen a lot of targets being set. net zero, circularity, etc. How do you actually get there? It is a question of resource allocation. And so a couple of years ago, we acquired a business called Copperleaf, which is asset investment planning. And they use AI, something called decision analytics, to analyze hundreds of thousands of potential investment scenarios to decide what is best for your network of assets with customers like National Grid. And that can incorporate climate scenarios. It can incorporate net zero goals and emissions into those decisions. So it's not setting separately, but it's in those decisions about capital allocation that are taking place at the board level, 10, 15, 20-year decisions that can be iteratively reviewed. And that kind of thinking of hundreds of thousands of potential investment cases, what's the best one, is very difficult for humans to do. So that's where I'm excited about technology coming in, not just for the small optimization efficiency gains, but really the longer term capital allocation and resource planning that gets us towards those difficult net zero and business transformation goals.
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head. There are so many things happening that you have to make decisions for the long term. How do you tell the difference between what's urgent and what's important and what's critical? Because honestly, there's so much going on that you spend an awful lot of time reacting. And how do you actually combine that reactive management with long-term sustainable decision making that means you're going to be here in 5, 10, 15 years? And that brings me to another question, and one that comes up a lot around AI, which is what's going to happen to industry over the next 5, 10, 15 years. There's a lot of discussion about the replacement of people. There's a lot of discussion about how work's going to change. But one of the things I'd really like to understand is what you've described as blue-collar AI. What exactly is that? What are we talking about and what does it mean?
So when I say industrial AI or blue-collar AI, I'm referring to the work with the 70% of the workforce that is not behind a desk. So we are talking about engineers in the field, technicians going out to maintain an asset, planners, dispatchers, operators. It's the people who are really doing the work, making it happen. And when most people think of AI, particularly in the last few years, they think of the AI that you can pick up on your phone, generate an image, rewrite an email, Copilot, ChatGPT, generative AI. But when we talk about blue collar AI, it is much more invisible. And we actually released some research last year called the Invisible Revolution. And it is about the AI that is being embedded in the manufacturing process, in the factory floor, in the wind turbine and energy infrastructure, in the airplane engine. For example, one of our customers, Rolls-Royce, they have thousands of sensors over their engine that then feeds all that data into what they call the blue thread of data, so that they can in real time monitor the health of their airplane engine and predict when it would need maintenance and avoid unnecessary downtime or maintenance. That's an example of where we're using sensors over assets, connecting all that data together to drive insights. And it's embedded in the workflows. And people say, how often do you use AI a day? Put your hand up if you use it 5 times or 10 times. But increasingly, that question is going to become irrelevant because AI is becoming embedded in everything that we eat and what we wear and the products that we enjoy. So that's really the space that I work, is not so much in the generative and entertainment AI, but much more in the industrial where the operations happen. What's AI doing? And I see it as 3 different things. One, it's helping us to do more with less with industrial operations. So efficiency gains, and I'll give you an example there quickly.
Great.
Planning and scheduling optimization. One of the things that IFS provide and uses agentic AI capabilities is a planning and scheduling optimization engine that, for those potentially tens of thousands of engineers that a company might have in the field, routes them according to the skill needed, according to the best route. That actually reduces travel distance by 37%. That's based on some work that I did last year with over 60 customers. So we can see there that this is not just a story of productivity and cost savings, but it's clearly a big carbon footprint reduction as well. So that's industrial AI giving industrial scale sustainability gains. And that's what I would call in the bucket, do more with less. Let's be efficient. And it's a clear win-win for business as well, right? There's a commercial case and a sustainability case. The second thing that I'd see is really helping companies to transform. And I've already given the example around asset investment planning, thinking about how AI can help with longer term transformations. And then the third area that I see AI and industrial AI coming in to support companies is really getting a hold of their data. I recently was on a webinar about utilities, and utilities sector and energy sector actually have the most data of any sector and tons of historical data as well. So how do you combine all of these different sources of data to get smarter about the business, but also about things like the environment? So there's a lot of investment going in, for example, to wildfire prevention systems. I remember reading about the ability to now predict with great accuracy where lightning will strike, which is a big contributor to wildfires. So AI can help combine all of these different data from multiple sources to give us better insights that help businesses be more resilient and more sustainable.
Your point about being able to predict where lightning will strike is fascinating, because I saw that Copernicus has come out with its latest update on climate scenarios and weather prediction, and it is so fundamental to actually understand where shocks are going to hit. You have to look at this at multiple levels because the impacts will come at different levels. But I think one of the things that people want to know is what are the kind of operational decisions that need to be made? And you've covered that in terms of managing data. We all have experience of having to deal with utilities who often don't have the most up-to-date data sets and ability to manage complex systems. Are there general things that companies should look at? Maybe not necessarily just in an asset-heavy, intensive industry, because that's got a very specific experience. Are there lessons you think that can be shared for businesses more generally about what they should be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from a sustainability perspective, getting more real time with what we do is critical. We cannot be a reporting function of center looking backwards at what was done with data full of estimates and holes. We have to be much more real time and looking ahead, right? What's coming around the curve? How do we help the business with its growth, with its resilience, both that downside and the upside, right? The top line growth as well. And when I look at our carbon footprint, for example, even in IFS, in a service-based industry, so not in an asset-intensive industry ourselves, we would look at where are there anomalies in the data? How can we use AI to help us spot those, predict those, understand and test different strategies on carbon management? So there are opportunities to bring AI in and use things like anomaly detection, prediction, and much better forecasting capabilities that we get through AI. And again, combining lots of different sources of data to help us. And I'll give you another tangible example. We use our own emissions reporting software, and we've partnered with a company called Climactic that have a database of hundreds of thousands of emissions factors. Every time I say the actual number, I check and it's already gone up again. So they've got loads and loads of emissions factors, and they use AI to map those emissions factors so that when you're choosing a supplier, you can see, okay, these are the emissions that would be associated with that material in that geography. And ideally, when you get to the point of from that specific supplier, that kind of visibility really helps us. And it takes a huge chunk of the manual work, the pain point of mapping to emissions factors that was previously done by sustainability teams. I'll give you another example from our team internally. Data is still the biggest headache of sustainability teams. That has only got worse as reporting requirements have increased, as the need for this to be more strategic and real time has also increased. This is about how do you get good quality data from the multiple sources where it exists, both inside the business and outside in your supply chain and stakeholders, and then use that to make decisions, to get insights and intelligence and make progress towards targets. So much more real-time and forward-looking. When we report and produce annual sustainability reports, it's often backwards-looking, right? So how do we get out of that mindset? And part of that is really being able to take out the manual work that's involved in reporting, not just getting more accurate with the data that we have, but also allowing sustainability teams to be more strategic and not be spending their time doing data crunching, emails, and chasing for stakeholder engagement, right? So that's where in my team, we've been using AI agents to take a big bite out of that manual work and allow us to focus on more strategic and more value add work, both for the business and honestly for the team, that is much more fulfilling around new marketing campaigns, new types of optimization that we have around our report and the content that we put online. So new types of work that are coming out to take the place of what was, quite a painful and time intensive process around reporting. So both getting more real time and forward looking, but also freeing up a lot of that time using AI agents and using it to do more strategic and value adding things.
Now, this is the ultimate end goal, that AI is able to manage the complex, boring tasks that are incredibly repetitive and take up huge amounts of time. But when we talk about AI being embedded in the wider systems that underpin what we do through agriculture, manufacturing, retail, whatever it might be, what can go wrong? What is it we need to keep an eye on? How do companies go about effectively integrating AI into these processes while still ensuring that everything works the way it's supposed to?
I think this is a particularly pertinent question with the rise of agentic AI, because we're moving from AI that advises to AI that acts. And so we have a part of the business called IFS Loops that really looks at what we call digital workers, so agents embedded in industrial operations, doing things like supporting smarter inventory and materials replenishment. And what they have done is create a supervisor agent. So it is designed AI first. So it's built up from the ground with AI, and AI giving both advice and taking action. But critically, there is human in the loop that monitors that supervisor agent. So agents can supervise a number of agents that are each carrying out different tasks, so they're interrelated, but then there is a human in the loop. And I think that's particularly important, right? And what I'm seeing with sustainability peers is that we need to be bold, and perhaps we're not confident enough. We need to go and play in the sandbox of what this can do for us. Always be conscious of, where do I have my human in the loop? Where do I have my controls? That's particularly important, obviously, when we're dealing with sensitive data. But with that really deliberate design around, here are the controls, here are the human in the loop, but here are all the things that the agents can do for us, we get savings of over 70% productivity within something like a sustainability reporting cycle. And I think that the other thing is, consult and learn from each other. This is not something where one organization has got it right. Even as I said, my team playing in the sandbox, we've been developing agents ourselves, integrating it with the products that we develop for customers. But we've also been testing it through the reporting cycle. We've been engaging with the auditors. We've been checking with the stakeholders that we work with to collect the data. Does it work for them? Because this needs to be an adoption story that is not just within the sustainability team, but wider. And it needs to be one that has the appropriate governance and controls. And therefore, working with a party like auditors and assurance is really important.
Well, I think there are two issues that come up, one of which is, when we're talking about net benefit, is that evenly distributed? Because obviously there's going to be winners and losers in this. But this is the thing about all of these conversations, which is identifying the trade-offs, because we do sometimes lose something in one place to gain in another. Or there's the temporal aspect, that you may lose something in the short term, but in the medium term, you're going to do better. And I think there is a concern that we have this approach where we solve one problem in one area. So that's efficiency or optimization, the effective deployment of large-scale AI. But that can create pressure somewhere else in the system. Do you think standards are the best way to address that? Is increased transparency driven by standards, or is this just something that needs to be a wider part of the conversation?
I think there are certainly risks and trade-offs, and it's important to be honest about them. I think the dialogue at this point is really critical. This is not something where we need to wait a year and then we'll revisit it. But at the same time, it can't be seen to be putting the brakes on AI development. That simply won't fly. And so a nice phrase that I heard the other day was aim higher. Don't slow down, aim higher with what we're doing.
Right.
And I think that means when we talk about AI ethics, which is a huge topic,
Yeah.
we're thinking about, okay, well, this could accelerate decarbonization, but it could have a potentially negative social effect on a particular community or on employees. So those kind of trade-offs need to be discussed and debated as we're developing AI, not just for the purpose that we intend AI to be used, but, and this is the difficult thing, for other potential uses of the AI that we're developing, right? Because we ultimately, and we've seen this recently with Claude, the AI might be developed for one purpose, but it has other uses there. So I think it's really important for us to be honest about the risks. And we've recently set up AI Trust Office, where we look at trusted and governed AI, how we incorporate clear permissions, auditability, fail-safe, humans kept in the loop. So we're developing AI very deliberately with these considerations in mind. But certainly I would agree that, sustainability, this is not new with AI particularly, but sustainability often carries trade-offs. I worked previously in a bank, and it was, well, we shouldn't fund this power plant, but if we don't, then a community will lose access to power. So trade-offs are nothing new for us in sustainability. And I think the key here is transparency and debate at this stage. And maybe just to give an example from my world, I've launched a customer network last year where it brings together chief sustainability officers from customers, from peers, from industry leaders, and with expert speakers to address topics on sustainability like circularity, like regulation, always with AI in mind. Mm-hmm. How can AI help us? What do we need to be careful around? What are some of the trade-offs? So those are the rooms where those conversations happen with honesty and transparency. And I think that's what we need more of.
The fact that you mention some similarities in experience with sustainability and AI deployment is incredibly important because it is that nuanced conversation. What we're seeing with AI is a level of disruption to how we think about doing things that sustainability itself actually brought to front of mind. Now, one of the things I'd love to know a little bit more about, and this actually comes from a question about your own experience and as a sustainability leader, because one of the things we all know is one of the problems sustainability faces is the fact that everybody operates in silos and there isn't a lot of cross-fertilization. But we know that these teams, sustainability teams and finance teams and ops teams and tech teams, have often actually worked separately. But as AI, operational intelligence, as it becomes embedded in industrial systems, does that change those relationships inside organizations? And why is the relationship between the sustainability team, the technical team and the operational team, the leadership of those teams, why is that becoming so important?
I think it goes back to your question of where do the emissions sit in operations, and particularly with the industrial customers that we work with. And it is in the supply chain and it is in the day-to-day operations. If sustainability is sitting completely separate, just reporting on that backwards looking at the end of every year, nothing's ever going to change. So the ability for sustainability teams to integrate themselves and embed policies, practices within those operational and supply chain teams is paramount. And my personal belief is that it's not great to have a huge sustainability team trying to do that from the perspective of a sustainability team. I need a procurement expert with some knowledge of sustainability to apply that into their day-to-day. I need a maintenance expert to apply that into their day-to-day decisions and operations, et cetera, et cetera. So, how does that work in practice? I've set up a network here in IFS, which is business partners. So every executive nominates within their function business partners for sustainability. And again, I think when you come to the industrial operations and you look at procurement, for example, if I go back to supply chain, how do we integrate emissions alongside those procurement decisions so they're not just looking at cost, time frame, but they're also looking at sustainability, and they're integrating with platforms like Integrity Next, which we've done. Climactic for emissions factor is really crucial so that the data and the information is at the fingertips of the people who are actually making the decisions day to day. And it's not just something that is reported to the sustainability team at the end. And to your point on the working relationship between the CIO or CTO and the Chief Sustainability Officer, I think it's never been more important. We are looking at how AI can be adopted in our business. It is a change management story. It is an adoption story. That's kind of nothing new for us in sustainability, right? But what is new for us and what we need to lean into is how can AI help us on that journey? How is the organization applying that? How does that change the data that they are both producing, analyzing, and getting insights from, and how can we make the most of that? So the agents that we developed in my team came out of an IT AI hackathon that we took part in the sustainability team, and we put our hands up and said, include us for 2 days out of our normal work, and we just want to sit next to you in the IT team and build agents that will help both us but also the wider business from sales to reporting functions on sustainability. And I think that kind of collaboration is really critical.
I love that, because one of the things I've always believed is that, ridiculous as this sounds, those working in sustainability should be working to make themselves redundant, because sustainability should be fundamental in every function. And AI is an enabler of that, which is actually a very exciting opportunity. And I think a lot of this does depend on what's the lens you use to explore how you use technology, what that means for sustainability, and how transparent you are about what is going on at what stage. But what is it, do you think, most people misunderstand about how emissions actually get reduced that would be really useful for those executives thinking about how to introduce this kind of technology?
Go back to the research that I mentioned earlier, that if 25 to 30% of emissions are waste emissions from inefficiency and poor maintenance from aging infrastructure, then one of the fastest paths that we have is to run what we already have more efficiently, more effectively, and AI is the most powerful tool available right now to help us do that. If you look at the IEA, they call it the first fuel, energy efficiency. It's not the shiny new thing that we build out big capex projects, but it is how do we do more with less? How do we do better with what we already have? And that requires data over what we already have, real time, and the ability to act on that and forecast what's around the corner. And that's what I would say is one of the biggest, I'm not sure if misunderstanding, but doesn't catch people.
I think the message of doing more with less is something that probably speaks to everyone because a lot of people are having to do that in their day-to-day lives. It feels like common sense. And I think that's probably one thing that many people may feel isn't part of the conversation with big technological and structural transformations. Sophie, honestly, you've talked about so many things that are so fundamental to what we need to be thinking about, whether it's about sustainability, whether it's about operational growth, whether it's the future of work. I've really enjoyed it and thank you for your time. If listeners were going to take one idea away from our conversation about how operational systems are changing and what that actually means for resilience and infrastructure and for sustainability, what would you most want them to understand?
I want listeners to take away that the biggest shift right now is moving sustainability and resilience into the operational layer. So that's where decisions are made every hour, not every quarter, not something that's reported in an annual report looking back. We're entering a world where industries have to be agile. They have to be quick on their feet. Competitive advantage is really coming from the ability to decide and to act across complex industrial systems very, very quickly. That matters for emissions because then we get into a large share of the avoidable emissions being from not doing that, right? From not having that real-time data, from not making those decisions over assets using the intelligence in real time. And it matters for resilience because disruption then can be predicted, managed, and avoided. So there's a practical and immediate opportunity around that doing more with less and moving sustainability into that operational layer, the invisible revolution that we call it, with AI being embedded and sustainability being embedded into the operational layer. That presents a huge opportunity for immediate emissions reduction. And I'm very excited around what else AI can do for us. But I think for me, that's really the top of mind thing that I'd want listeners to take away.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I've learned a great deal and hopefully our listeners have as well. I think what this conversation really highlights is that all of the systems that we depend on, whether they're physical or operational or infrastructural, they're all becoming far more dynamic. They're interconnected and they're operationally complex in a way that very few people, I think, really understand. And if we're talking about sustainability, we often talk about it in terms of targets and reporting or future ambitions. But actually, there's a much more practical challenge emerging around how industrial systems actually function in real time. What's wasted, how energy is managed, how infrastructure adapts under pressure and becomes resilient, and how organizations make the right operational decisions in increasingly volatile conditions, especially one where things like data centers are critical infrastructure, but have an impact on what are seen as critical systems, whether that's energy security or resource supply. So that's increasingly where we're seeing AI starting to sit, not as a productivity tool, but as part of the operational layer that's helping to transform operations and industry. But as we also discussed today, that raises important questions around resilience and dependency, about governance, energy demand and supply, and how organizations manage disruption, manage these increasingly interconnected systems responsibly. So I hope you found the conversation interesting and perhaps that it offered a slightly different perspective on where sustainability and infrastructure and operational resilience are beginning to converge in practice. So if you did enjoy the episode, please do follow or subscribe to Shaken Not Burned and share it with anyone you think might find it worthwhile. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon.